Seriously though, we are embarking on a new book, and it's not just any naked book. No, this one is practically begging to be picked apart. So much so that I was able to secure a used copy that didn't even seem to have been opened. Like, you know when you first open a new book and you get that that spine crack? So satisfying. It strikes me as a bit weird that I could find a used copy in the beginning of March when this came out towards the end of February. So what is this book? Well, let me tease you a little bit longer by opining, that publishing books catered to the anti-woke crowd must be an extremely lucrative endeavor, as this is this author's second foray into that niche or genre or whatever you want to call it. Although this one isn't exclusively focused on those assigned female at birth. Yes, dear viewer, this is none other than Abigail Shrier's second book, Bad Therapy, or Why the Kids Aren't Growing Up. Between her and Jordan Peterson, with the rate they're putting out books full of poor source handling and wild conjecture that take me a disproportionate amount of time to go through, debunk, check the sources, or at least contextualize things, I probably have some job security for the foreseeable future. This video made possible thanks to the continuing support of viewers, patrons, and PayPal pals like you. Thanks! Hello. We here, me here at Cass Eris, I'm a Cass, am apparently still in the debunking driver's seat. It is a long haul route I'm on. And if you're new, an extra special hello. Let's get you oriented. I am a cognitive psychologist, PhD even. Broadly speaking, that puts me in the experimental side of the field, which is the other side of the field, sometimes a whole other stadium from counseling psychology. And I'll link a video in the places that explains the differences between the different parts of psychology more. Cognitive is not counseling to such an extent that I have zero training experience or courses taken in counseling. There were a couple that might count in undergrad, abnormal psychology, where we talked about psychological disorders, and psychological testing, where we talked about the different standardized tests that mental health practitioners can use in their practice. That's it. So in other words, what I'm bringing to the table is not specialized hands-on knowledge or specialized experience as a practitioner. That ain't my bag. What is in my bag are a particular set of skills. Skills I've acquired over a PhD and my pivot to YouTube. Skills that make me a nightmare for people like Shrier. If she stopped publishing this dreck, I could move on. I could talk about the fun and, more importantly, good research coming out of cognitive perception and neuropsych. But she hasn't. So, I will read this book, I will go through its references, I will share the issues, and I will kill this book. Okay, the taken speech might have been a bit much, but yeah, we're going to do a science at this book and see how well it holds up to a close reading. If it's anything like her previous book, the answer is going to be not well. We previously went through Irreversible Damage, subtitled The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters, in what I thought at the outset was going to be a quick little project between Peterson's two life advice books. The progression of that series' thumbnails on screen should let you know how quick that project ended up being. 14 videos in total. Part of that number was influenced by what Shrier uses for sources. Don't get me wrong, I applaud Shrier for the more thorough referencing in her books. I definitely would prefer that to the more minimalist style Peterson has switched to for Beyond Order 12 More Rules for Life. A recurring problem in Irreversible Damage was the inclusion of anti-trans people blogs, sometimes even tweets, as support for her claims. And not just as oh, this was said by somebody, here you go, but presented as evidence as substantive as peer-reviewed work. But in the so-called gender-critical space, this is par for the course, even in published in +1 work. But I digress. I haven't yet finished the project of entering her works cited into my reference manager, so I can't say it doesn't happen. Just so far, it seems to be less the case, which makes sense given the two niches the books sit in. Irreversible Damage fit well in the mum's net nature of the concerned parents talking in invite-only chat groups, of parents terrified at the prospect of their child being anything other than what the doctor announced at the time of their birth, and living a life that the parents hadn't planned out for them. As evidenced by some of Shrier's own references in this book, the therapy bad movement is a much older phenomenon, with the oldest reference definitely about this going to 2001, but older related ones dating even earlier. We will cover some familiar territory in this book, as Irreversible Damage had a chapter on the therapists and the damage they were doing to the kids by following the established treatment guidelines by the different medical and psychological associations. This time, Shrier sets her sights more broadly, not just on the gender-questioning trans and or non-binary youths who have to meet with therapists in order to get gender-affirming care. This time, she's just going after all of therapy, kinda. We're going to stick a quick pin in that kinda so I can introduce or refresh the visual cues I use to indicate where ideas are coming from. This means I'm paraphrasing the book. This means I'm responding to the book or integrating my thoughts with science when I can. I also use this when discussing Shrier's references. The intro chapter is a quick little thing, so it only has 9 citations. Okay, last thing to do is the YouTube channel blah blah. So if you enjoy my edutainment, would you please consider subscribing, leaving a like? Yes. I had previously set a goal for 42,000 subs because I'm a nerd, but you know what? Fuck it. I want that silver play button. So this is me putting my intent out to the universe that I would like 100,000 subs. So go on. Get to it. Subscribe. Doctor's orders. I don't know if this is showing up on camera, but just in case it is, to address the marionette hole I have, this is from a skin biopsy I had done a week and a half ago, neurologist ordered, and this is the only one in a spot you get to see for free. They didn't drill deep, so it's just a flesh wound. It's just I'm gonna have that until the skin heals and comes back. Alrighty, let's get this anti-therapy bus on the road. Similar to how Shrier started Irreversible Damage, this book opens with an author's note, and it's morbidly funny to me that they're basically along the same lines. In this therapy bad book, she starts out by trying to hedge everything that will follow with a sort of disclaimer. Yes, there are kids with, quote, profound mental illness. These are the youths deserving of all the mental health care they can get their hands on and are not the subject of this book. No. This book is about those she considers, in her journalistic estimation, to be subclinical. The, quote, worriers and, quote, fearful. The, quote, lonely, lost, and sad. But don't get it twisted, dear reader. It's not about anxiety or depression. No. She asserts that these youths try to find diagnoses for how they're feeling, but can't seem to stick to a label. And by giving these youths mental health help, we are using, quote, the wrong sort of cure. She's drawing a distinction between the, let's call them medically real mental health conditions and those that aren't. We haven't even started the book proper yet, and it's already on shaky ground. It's tempting to think that the boundary between the real or actual psychological disorders and everything subclinical is etched in stone. Thing is, it typically isn't that clear cut. It's like there is a line there, but the ink bled on it. Sometimes a little, sometimes a lot. If you meet the diagnostic criteria for, let's say, depression, you'll be on this side of the line, and if you don't meet the diagnostic criteria, you'll be on that side. But that clinically significant depression line needs you to have at least 5 symptoms for at least 2 weeks, and for it to be different to how you were prior to the start of the symptoms, as well as the additional requirements at the bottom, like it being impairing and not attributable to something else. Look at the group of possible depressive symptoms. You have to have a little more than half of them, not necessarily all of them, to meet the diagnostic criteria. Also, you could have these symptoms, but not meet the criteria because it's not impairing or impacting your life. What's depression for one person may look different than depression for another person. Such is the nature of the beast right now. As pointed out in the reference on screen here, thinking that there is a simple distinction between disordered and not disordered is, quote, not justifiable, not necessary, and not useful for practice. It's worth noting that in this book chapter, De Vries is arguing for practitioners to take a reflective approach when trying to decide if somebody's symptoms meet the diagnostic criteria. That diagnostic criteria is just one facet for them to consider in making that call. And let's not lose the plot already. My basic point is that Shrier's implicit argument that these two groups are ontologically distinct is suspect. There are all kinds of factors that may make a person more or less likely to develop a condition, mental or bodily. Environmental risks, genetic predispositions, developmental factors, and just random chance. We aren't yet at a point where we can say with 100% certainty that a person will or won't develop something. The best we can do is statistically informed, and statistically very well informed for some conditions, educated guesses. And the same can be true for diagnosing the stuff that's there. Sure, for some things, tests like a biopsy or blood work are possible and can confirm a certain diagnosis. But for a lot of things, dare I say the majority, there isn't just this nice little test the doctor can do that will let them say with zero doubt, I hereby diagnose you with depression. Let us now commence the incredibly clear-cut and straightforward process of treatment that will absolutely work for you. Now, I'm not arguing against the progress of modern medicine and the amazing advancements that have happened on a regular basis, like this test is pretty new. What I am saying is that this sort of thinking, where a real diagnosis will have real easy tests that the doctor can interpret with 100% certainty, it's a sort of bless your heart, naive thinking that, in my opinion, would come from somebody who hasn't really had to deal with diagnostic hardships. Oh, right. Irreversible damage also had this sort of two-box disclaimer in it. In that case, it was distinguishing between the transgender adults she considered legitimate, well, more legitimate. As included in this note, she said she'd try to honor their preferred pronouns where convenient, and if memory serves, that ended up not really happening all the time. And the youths for whom she decided she was going to use their parents' preferred pronouns and pseudonyms for, while talking about them, without their consent. So, in her first book, there were the legitimate transgender adults, and then there were the youths she considered, quote, transgender crazed. And now in this book, we have the, quote, sufferers of profound mental illness, and the youths who aren't that. I'd say that must be such a simple, untroubled way to go through life, breaking everything into two boxes and not worrying about any of the nuance or details or anything. And then I remember the whole culture war that's been spun up out of that way of thinking, and yeah, no, I will stick to the shades of gray. Thanks. Shrier starts the content of the book by sharing a story about her 12-year-old son. He had left summer camp with tummy trouble, so she took him to the doctor. After the doctor said it's probably nothing to worry about, quote, and bustled a large man in black scrubs wielding a clipboard who wanted to ask her son some questions in private. Shrier was not going to have that. She insisted to know what this was about. And he showed her the questions he was going to ask, which were basically screener questions for, let's say, bad depression. And she notes that this nurse is basically following the script, which includes trying to get the parents out of the room to talk to the kid alone. Driving my son home from the clinic, I was haunted by the following possibility. What if I had been just a little more trusting? Children often try to please adults by producing whatever answers the grown-ups seem to want. What if my son, alone in the room with that large man, had given him the yes the questions appeared to prompt? Would the staff have prevented me from taking my son home? Shrier is still on that fear-mongering game. Surprised? And a child who was entertaining dark thoughts. Was this really the best way to help him? Separate him from his parents and present him with a series of escalating questions about killing himself? This will be the last of the quotes for a bit, I promise. She just has such a way with words, you know? I hadn't signed my son up for therapy. I hadn't taken him for a neuropsychological evaluation. I had taken him to the pediatrician for a stomachache. There was no indication, no reason to even suspect that my son had any mental illness, and the nurse didn't wait for one. He knew he didn't have to. References 1 and 2 are to the National Institute of Mental Health website, specifically the ASQ, or Ask Suicide Screening Questions. The files Shrier is pointing us to are the screener questions and script for nurses, respectively. The script includes what to say to the parent or guardian to try to get the child some privacy, then what to say to the patient throughout this process. The last part is what to say to the caregiver if the child screens positive. Basically that they are concerned about the child's safety, so they'd like to follow up on this before giving recommendations on who to see next. In the screening questions themselves, the child is asked 4 questions about their mental state, and if they answer affirmatively to any of them, a 5th question is asked. I want to point out a couple things here, starting with the structure of the ASQ. On the left are the screener questions, on the right is how it's included in Shrier's book. She's rolled the 5th question into the other 4, instead of it being contingent on how the child has answered those. While this can seem like a subtle change, it dramatically changes the impact. Yeah, it would be absurd to ask a random child showing up with a stomachache if they're ideating without a cause. That's why they are only asked that if they're given some indication that it's in their thoughts. If we look at the next steps on the screening tool, we can see how these answers are interpreted. If the child answered no, then that's that. Unless clinical judgment suggests the child may not have been straightforward in their answers, such as the clinician noticing wounds that appear to be self-inflicted. If the child answered yes to all, including the 5th question, that's a, quote, acute positive screen, indicating that action should be taken now to keep the child safe. Further evaluation should happen before the family leaves. If the child answered yes to the first 4 but not the 5th, that's a, quote, non-acute positive screen. The child should still be evaluated some more for their safety, but it's not the urgent situation of the acute positive. So yeah, Shrier, had your son screen positive, assuming the nurse was allowed to do this at all, which I'm not entirely sure of, the staff probably would have tried to at least delay you in taking your son home. Because if he's answering yes to these questions, he is not in an okay headspace and something should be done about that. And if there was a yes to that last question, he might not be safe at home right now. Another thing to get into is the why behind the screening tool. These 4+1 questions were the result of a much larger development process to try and catch and prevent kids from attempting and possibly succeeding at suicide. This experiment had a pool of potential screener questions, and based on the statistical analysis for which questions got them the most predictive bang for their buck, narrowed it down to this handful. It's noted in the introduction that the best prevention approach is, quote, early identification and treatment. But, using signal detection jargon, there were many missed signals happening, as, quote, the majority of individuals who die by suicide have visited a healthcare provider in the year before their death, most within the prior 3 months. A relevant part to Shrier's story, and why her son may have been flagged, is that, quote, individuals often present solely with somatic, so bodily, complaints, and infrequently discuss suicidal thoughts and plans unless asked directly. In the paper's discussion, it's noted that some of the non-psychiatric screener hits, so people who came in for not psychiatric reasons, may have otherwise gone unnoticed, quote, as their chief complaints were medical in nature, e.g., ankle injury, abdominal pain, headaches. So to answer Shrier's questions here, yes, this is one of the better ways we have to try to catch these sorts of thought patterns and feelings in youths before they act on them, or even just suffer in those feelings. Yes, she had taken him in for a stomachache, but as noted in the Horowitz paper, that may be what kids with depression are rolling into the doctor's office with. And now it's Cass story time. As indicated by the content advisory earlier, I was given a similar set of questions by my pediatrician while I was in 7th grade. The ASQ was developed long after I was an adult, so it wasn't that, but had a similar gist. I don't remember the reason for the appointment. I do remember that the pediatrician had my mom leave the room while I filled out the clipboard of questions, and yeah, not good. I wasn't in a place where I would have answered the ASQ 5th question with a yes, but there were plenty of other yeses. Honestly, I could have answered the first question with a yes as early as 1st grade, but that's beside the point. I don't know what the doctor said to my mom afterwards. That happened in the hallway with the door closed. But I do remember sitting there wondering if I'd fucked up by answering honestly. That she now had this information, and I didn't know what she was going to do. By that point, my dad had spent many long nights with me, just talking and listening to basically my depression. And this wasn't something I could talk to my mom about. She hadn't really responded well to the couple snippets of the deep, dark feelings I had shared with her. Long story short, I was started on antidepressants soon after, as well as therapy, which was ostensibly for me, but other than 5 minutes at the beginning and like 5 minutes at the end, I waited outside while my parents were in with the therapist. But I digress. My mom had similar sentiments to Shrier here. That, quote, there was no indication, no reason to even suspect that I had any mental illness. To the point that she still holds a grudge to this day, decades later, with that doctor for starting me on that journey. Even though I undeniably have some psychiatric issues similar in nature to my dad's. Denial. But as I said, after filling out that questionnaire, I worried I fucked up. That I should have given the everything's hunky-dory answers because I didn't know how my mom was going to react to the news that I was depressed. Because this giving the answers the adult wants isn't just for medical professionals. It's also true for the kids' parents. Children are sensitive to their parents' moods and are capable of lying to protect themselves from negative consequences. As was true for me, the child may be just as likely, if not more so given who they're going home with afterwards, to give answers the parent wants to hear. That may be part of why the screener questions try to give the kids some privacy. When you add on the research indicating that parents tend to rate their offspring's depression as being less bad than the youths themselves rate it, and that kids are sensitive to how dismissive their parents are of their emotions, it's not a stretch to think that a youth may downplay the severity of what they're feeling, especially around the dismissive parent. Like I did, until I was alone in the doctor's office filling out a questionnaire. Broadly, it's interesting, concerning that she would have this sort of reaction to him being screened for depression. Not that he was taken from them and put in a psych hold or given the full battery of depression questions. Just ask some screener questions with her out of the room. Let's see what her justification is for this almost panic response. We parents have become so frantic, hypervigilant, and borderline obsessive about our kids' mental health that we routinely allow all manner of mental health expert to evict us from the room. We will let you know. We've been relying on them for decades to tell us how to raise well-adjusted kids. Maybe we were overcompensating for the fact that our own parents had assumed the opposite, that psychologists were the last people you should consult on how to raise normal kids. I guess there's some other details about me I should clarify before moving forward. Shrier is somewhere in the Gen X age bracket, while I am an elder millennial. I'm getting more crotchety by the day. But I think both of our parents were baby boomers. Mine just had me a bit later. Also, I don't have kids. I have cats. I have no intention of having kids. Every intention of keeping the cats. That does hinder my ability to talk directly about the experiences of raising kids, what the schools are doing with the therapy, whose advice you should follow, all of that. But I do have friends with kids who I can ask about their experiences. I know it's not quite the same, but it's not like I have nothing. All that said, I know for a fact that my parents deferred to experts like Dr. Spock, the pediatrician who argued against totalitarian parenting and taught child development at what is now Case Western. This is so frustrating and entirely unsurprising given her previous book. This fuck the experts who disagree mentality so pervasive throughout her work. Why do they think they'd know more than a mother on how to raise their children? Because they've studied families and the different ways parents can parent and the impact it has on the children's well-being and development? Mother knows best. While my parents certainly weren't perfect in their rearing of me, and at the end of the day, no parent is, let's be real, I would absolutely take their approach to that of their parents. My dad's dad was an abusive tyrant, and my mom's parents were, let's say, old-fashioned when it came to things like discipline and gender roles. I will not relitigate this point here. Corporal punishment is not an effective parenting strategy. You want to argue? Go to the linked video and do it there. Shrier uses a weird rhetorical writing thing here. She starts off talking about her and her brother as we, and then at some point, and I'm not entirely sure exactly where, she shifts to a rhetorical we that goes beyond just her and her brother, and I would guess excludes her for some of these things. She describes a childhood for her and her brother that involves spanking, no choice in what they ate or how they dressed, but these things didn't bother them. Quote, "It would be years before anyone in my generation would regard these perfectly average markers of an 80s childhood as vectors of emotional injury. This is part of why I brought up our ages. I was also a child of the 80s and the 90s. Like, I was born in the early 80s, so had some childhood in the 80s and some in the 90s. I was not spanked. I had a lot of say in what I wore, except about jackets, but I mean, what kid is going to win that fight? And I was a picky eater. Example by way of McDonald's, the ace up every parent's sleeve who's just trying to get their kid to fucking eat. There were phases. First phase I remember, I didn't eat the middle of the french fries, only ate the ends. Middle was gross. And then I flipped it, so then I wouldn't eat the ends of the french fries because they were pointy and it hurt, and only ate the middle part. Then fries were entirely okay. Yay. The burger. So I would only eat the patty part and the toppings, not the bun. And then I flipped it again. So then I would eat the bun, but not the patty. And now you'll be happy to know I eat the entirety of french fries and the entirety of hamburgers, although I prefer soggy french fries, which works out because Dr. Husband likes the crispy french fries. It's a good functional marriage. All of those things were due to sensitivities and different preferences about what mouthfeel I could tolerate and not tolerate. And before autism, I know. Maybe? My point is that in a very close by neighboring age cohort, things were different from her description of it. I'm not disputing her description of her childhood and how it was for her. I'm just saying that her description wasn't the norm of that time period. Also, it seems like an implicit argument here is that Shrier and her brother turned out fine, despite their parents using what would be considered today old-fashioned methods. Are you fine, Shrier? Is all of this fine? I'm sure the gender-critical brainworms tell you this is all fine. But as millions of women and men my age entered adulthood, we commenced therapy. We explored our childhoods and learned to see our parents as emotionally stunted. Emotionally stunted parents inflicted emotional injury. Endnote 3 is to a comment about the proportion of Gen X who, she says, quote, received therapy or other mental health treatments in 2018 alone, according to an American Psychological Association report on stress. This report was published in late 2018 and was focused on what Americans feel stressed about and how they cope. Stress in 2018. Ah, the good old days, right? So as we go through this book, I'm going to try to keep the dates in mind because shit keeps changing on us and we're just historical event after historical event and it shows no sign of slowing down. I have the sneaking suspicion that Shrier won't be so keen to do that contextualization, which would make it a lot easier to compare 2024 apples to 2015 oranges or 2000 pears. The statistic Shrier included comes from the section on self-reported mental health and therapy utilization. While she did get the 26% correct for Gen X, she flubbed a detail. She said that was the percent use for 2018 alone, when in text it clarifies this is for currently receiving or previously received therapy. Potentially a big difference there. And note 4 is to the book Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents: How to Heal from Distant, Rejecting, or Self-Involved Parents. While I haven't read the book, I know people who have, and that it's helped them. In the process of trying to figure themselves out, this book gave them some insight into the parental dynamics that help shape their adult relationships, usually for the worst. Let's talk about why I have a problem with this rhetorical we. It makes it sound like this book was on everybody's bookshelf, that everyone went through therapy, read this book, and ended up thinking of their parents as emotionally stunted and injurious. While those things did happen for some people, it wasn't a universal Gen X millennial experience. Look again at the therapy utilization percentages. About a third of millennials and a quarter of X have ever had some sort of mental health treatment. In most parts of the world, we call those a minority of the group. But Shrier's talking it up as if it were the majority, if not universal. This will continue throughout this chapter. And book. The we continues for a bit, so let's summarize. Quote, we never doubted that we wanted kids of our own, and we would be better, more sensitive parents with the kids on a team with us. And these kids would be happy as dictated by self-help parenting books. Quote, we adopted a therapeutic approach to parenting. And from her description of things, it sounds like the authoritative approach, the recommended approach to parenting, which she incorrectly says uses the kid's happiness as the metric of parenting success. As such, the kid would experience, quote, no pain, no discomfort, no fights, no failure, and absolutely no hint of trauma, quotes hers. But the therapeutic approach to parenting meant it was impossible to deal with the kid feeling bad. So, we rushed our kids back to the mental health professionals who had guided our parenting, this time for testing, diagnosis, counseling, and medication. We needed our kids and everyone around them to know our kids weren't shy. They had social anxiety disorder or social phobia. They weren't poorly behaved. They had oppositional defiant disorder. They weren't disruptive students. They had ADHD. It wasn't our fault and it wasn't theirs. We would attack and finally eliminate the stigma surrounding these diagnoses. Rates at which our children receive them soared. In case it wasn't clear, she's saying all of this is a bad thing, a net negative, which is really fucking with me because I've had experience on both sides of this. On the one hand, mood disorders were somewhat normalized in my home because my dad was there to relate with me. It wasn't my fault that I was feeling the way I was feeling. It's just how my brain's wired, similar to his Tourette's. On the other, to use one of her examples, I was, as a child, and still am as an adult, shy. Painfully so. But at some point, I developed a pretty solid mask to hide how much I'm internally dying in some social situations. In that case, it's taken years, like decades, to find the best fitting explanation for why I'm shy like I am. And we're going to call it maybe-tism because getting a diagnosis at this point seems futile, especially as a woman. So just no. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. In either case, I can use the coping strategies as if it were to try to improve my well-being. Some of these coping strategies involve knowing and accepting my social limits. Sometimes this means that, whoop, we're done. I am going to go have a nice, long, deep conversation with this dog at a party, or I'm gonna go just check out the art and all the famous people on the walls at this fancy dinner. Pushing myself past my limits benefits no one. This whole thing smacks of the privilege of never really having had to deal with any of these conditions. A shy kid needs to be given more space than their more social peers if they're not going to be pushed into an emotional meltdown. Kids diagnosed with oppositional defiant disorder aren't just unruly kids. It's that turned to 11 with the knob broken off. And ADHD kids aren't just disruptive. Ask any parent of a kid with ADHD who is medicated, or even adults with ADHD, how well things go when there's a medication shortage. You can't bootstrap discipline any of these kids out of these behaviors and thought patterns because it truly isn't their fault. The best you can do, Shrier, is legitimately traumatize them in your attempts to shape them into at least appearing normal. Because that's what this seems to come down to. That these youths are perceived to be taking the easy way out by accepting these diagnoses instead of doing the hard work of shoving themselves into that normal box and suffering, as is tradition. And the super shitty part here is that having this understanding that these thought patterns or feelings are just a result of how you're built, in my opinion, is super helpful and important. Over the years, I have given myself so much more grace and understanding for the stuff that's depression or anxiety related than all of the things that I thought were my fault. I'm so friggin' difficult. Why do food tastes and textures have to bother me so much? Why can't I just eat the stupid peanut butter tortilla like all the other Girl Scouts instead of it being a thing? Why do I have so much difficulty making friends? There's something about me that seems to put some people off, and I don't understand why. This hello new person, it is very nice to meet you. Why am I blanking on anything to talk about with this person I just met? Come on, Cass, think of anything, just fucking anything to talk about with them. Stop being such a freak. I sometimes still get anxious, panic, and then blank when talking with people, especially new people. I don't beat myself up about it so much now, so that's something. And also, if anybody wants to come at me for my picky eating being such a problem, they can suck my dick. Got a whole bag of them for any takers. Dr. Mr. the Husband, script reviewer extraordinaire, and resident ADHD haver would like to insert a thought here. Quote, What the fuck is normal, and why are we expected to be it? Sitting at a desk as a 5-year-old is awful for so many of us. Why do we medicate to make it possible? Progress to me would be to understand better ways to accommodate rather than to whip everyone into the same mold. So, like, his mom at some point figured out in elementary school that she could get him to do his homework if he was sitting on a little bouncy ball, so he could just fidget. And that was her way of accommodating his needs there. So yeah, if Shrier was going to be arguing that therapy's bad because it's not meeting people with where their brain and body are at, instead trying to just therapize them into normalcy, perhaps her concerns could be addressed along the way. But, as you'll see, Shrier's not exactly pro-accommodations. More like the opposite. Shrier, the writer of our time, has spoken to loads of parents. Through that, she's heard about how much therapy these kids are getting, either in private or at school, and that, quote, expert diagnoses often altered kids' perceptions of themselves. Yeah, as I just said, that altered perception can mean the difference between having some peace and accepting just how your brain and body work, and flagellating yourself raw for not being normal. Unsurprisingly, since her previous book featured a chapter painting the culpability of schools in kids catching the trans, that's also going to be an aspect of this book. That schools, who are severely underfunded in many cases, my reference, not hers, have been able to expand their mental health staff and shift pedagogy so that trauma is the, quote, root of student misbehavior and academic underperformance. There are so many reasons for students to misbehave or underperform. Trauma is just one of them, and this citation dump that's happening on screen should give you an idea of how far beyond just trauma this goes. Shrier manages to miss the point by saying that all these efforts didn't manage to produce an army of high-achieving super students. The point of doing this wasn't for their academic success. That can be a happy side benefit of addressing their mental health problems, as doing that can then make school a more tolerable thing or just possible at all, but I think that the point in doing all this is to make these kids' lives less awful. Shrier doesn't see it that way. Instead, with unprecedented help from mental health experts, we have raised the loneliest, most anxious, depressed, pessimistic, helpless, and fearful generation on record. Why? This is her setup for the different portions of the book, so we will cross those bridges when we get there. Going through the remaining references is going to be our most expedient way through the rest of this chapter. And note 5 was regarding Gen Z. All of them, quote, declaring they never wanted kids of their own. This is coming from a piece by India Freya on Unheard, a platform that, quote, makes it their mission to challenge herd mentality wherever they see it. Unheard is for people who dare to think for themselves. The author is a columnist for the Quillette. I can't remember how this is pronounced. Like, I've only read it, so... Quillette? Quillette? Quileute? I don't know. Described on Wikipedia as having originally been intended to focus on scientific topics, but shifted to, quote, political and cultural issues concerning freedom of speech and identity politics. It has been described as libertarian-leaning and, nested quote, the right-wing's highly influential answer to Slate. The Unheard piece starts by linking off, allegedly to a, quote, new survey, which actually takes us to the Times talking about that survey, and I'm starting to remember part of why I hated the way Shrier sources info. I hit a paywall on the Times piece, so rip my ability to find the survey. So back to India, focusing in on, quote, the most common reason cited for the staggeringly high 25%-ish who don't want kids being that they, quote, wanted time for themselves. While she touches on the increasing difficulty in paying for offspring, it's just a passing remark on the way to the real issues. Those damn self-centered millennials and Zoomers, followed by the finger wagging about how we're going to regret not having kids later. As of this year, I can say that I am in my 40s, and I have yet to regret the no kids decision. Even after somebody tried to set me straight in my comments section by telling me that I am a stunted and incomplete adult until I have children. An argument similar to one of India's here. And note 6 was attached to a question of how the youths, despite, quote, receiving far more psychotherapy than any previous generation, plunged into a bottomless well of despair. The book mentioned, The Coddling of the American Mind, was published in 2018, and it was adapted from an Atlantic article the two authors wrote some years prior. Taking the TLDR from Wikipedia, the authors, quote, argue that overprotection is having a negative effect on university students, and that the use of trigger warnings and safe spaces does more harm than good. Further down the wiki, it notes the reception of the book as having been mixed. Some loved it, some questioned it, and some were on the fence. Yep, going back to Shrier's lengthy note here, I'm struck with the amount of unsourced claims. Even just page numbers to where these are in the book would have helped, assuming that's where she's pulling these from. And note 7 points to a couple news pieces about young versus old workers as support for one of Shrier's in-text arguments, which has a lot of specifics, so quote time. Bosses and teachers report, and young people agree, that members of the rising generation are utterly unprepared to accomplish basic tasks we expect all adults to dispatch. Ask for a raise. Show up for work during a period of national political strife. Show up for work at all. Fulfill obligations they undertake without requiring extensive breaks to attend to their mental health. Let's look at each of these points in turn, and I will let you know when that reference becomes relevant. Asking for a raise is hard, especially if you're junior in the hierarchy and are aware of how disposable you are in this job market. Quote, showing up for work during a period of national political strife. Shrier. Fuck political activism, strikes, marches, all of those mechanisms we have to legally try to force change, I guess. Not if it gets in the way of you being a good little busy bee. I guess it's worth mentioning that some jobs actually have that as a thing that you can bill your hours towards. Like, you attend a political protest on the clock while physically not being at work. How now, brown cow? Quote, showing up for work at all is the only spot those references are useful. So at least she put them in the right place, even if it makes the absence of citations everywhere else that much more noticeable. The piece in Time was largely about how a couple companies were bending over backwards to accommodate their older workers, such as giving them a 4-day work week so they could take care of health concerns on the 5th day, realizing that getting rid of experienced talent is a net negative for the company, even if the pay rate's higher, and other assorted perks for long-term employees. The only mention here of the youths is a quick little aside about them, quote, sometimes having problems with attendance. Sometimes. Like, don't get me wrong. It's good that some companies are coming around to the idea that experienced labor is good to have, and not just cutting people when they get too expensive and taking somebody green off the street, or if they have health conditions that require time and money to take care of. But there's a bit of a difference between, quote, sometimes having problems with attendance and not showing up at all. Also, I don't know if management is capable of considering this, but maybe, just maybe, those younger workers could be more motivated to show up if they were given access to the same sort of perks and treatment that the more senior people got, or even just seeing that they had some progression towards building that sort of tenure with the company. Instead of all the horror stories I've read about, like being told that, taking every Friday off to deal with this health problem of yours, that's just too much time off. Who do you think you are? Like, either get that sorted on your own time or don't bother coming back in. And I'm saying that as somebody who has various health problems I have been regularly told I'm too young for. At least I'm self-employed. Plus all those things that the older workers might not have to deal with that could impact their ability to come into work. Surprise! Landlord decides you're moving. Surprise! Your babysitter fell through. Surprise! Your car broke down on the way to work and your savings is non-existent. The other part of Shrier's citation is from the BBC, about the situation in Shropshire. Some businesses stop taking applications from people under 21 because they're either not showing up to interviews or dipping in their first week. That headline really oversold the story. Okay, so Shrier really stretched how applicable those stories were for this point, tossing aside any and all nuance. So, business as usual. Great. And Shrier's final item, needing mental health breaks while, quote, fulfilling obligations. I'm going to chalk this one up to the average Zoomer's amusing ability to call bullshit when they see it, and take space for themselves when they need it, instead of pushing through it en route to their fourth heart attack. They have seen through the capitalism matrix and can read the code. They know a lot of jobs are some form of joke and aren't willing to be ride or die for a company that wouldn't think twice about kicking them to the curb. Let's wrap this up. And note 8 is for the claim of teens putting off getting their driver's license because, quote, driving is scary, with her primary source being all those moms she talked to. Oh, and something from moms.com some years back. Moms.com is a website for moms, trying to be the one-stop info shop for busy moms. And looking around, at least they seem to have some solid guidelines for what will get published on the website, along with ethics and correction guidelines. So it doesn't seem to be part of the Mumsnet gender-critical wank fest I was worried it might be. This piece, filed under Funny Moments up at the top, talks about the survey results from a, quote, insurance company search engine known as the Zebra, and thankfully links over to it. The Zebra has a handy summary graphic pulling together the main results from their survey gizmo data of about 600 families. The percent of teens too scared to get their license is a whopping 25%. Out of curiosity, I hunted down what the figures were like around the time that I got my driver's license. We had cars then. Okay, so if we take a broad definition of teenager as anything under 20, which just happens to be consistent with this chart, shut up, I want to be done with this chapter, 40.7% of that population were drivers. But that figure isn't comparable to who is afraid to drive, so let's check out the 2018 data. And look at that, 41.5% of the 19 and under age group are drivers. If we look a couple years later, that proportion goes up to 49.7%. As you are taught by any statistical instructor worth their pedagogical salt, there's lies, damn lies, and statistics. Looking back at the methods for the Zebra survey, they include youths as young as 13. So we've got 13 through 15-year-olds answering a question about being too scared to drive. You know what? Driving can be scary. Even if you're driving a small car, you are responsible for this big, heavy murder machine going speeds well above what we would encounter naturally, short of falling off a cliff. It's even scarier if you've never done it, as I'm guessing the youths on the younger end of the spectrum haven't. Maybe they've been allowed to take a turn around the parking lot or something, but even that would just be a drop in the bucket experience-wise. It's good, and I'd say recommended even, to keep a healthy respect for what you're doing while driving. Novice to experienced. But it's important as a novice driver to give yourself time to build up that driving skill. Do effortful practice with it, and eventually parts of it will be sectioned off into more automatic, efficient processing chunks, and driving becomes easier. Like, driving literally is empirically easier the longer you've been doing it. So altogether for this point, the youths may be expressing some fears about driving, but that doesn't seem to actually be stopping them from getting their licenses. Cool! Shrier's pivoting out of spewing a bunch of statistics and figures at us and into the "won't somebody think of the children" mode. She says the youths are lonely and look for a psychiatric cause and then are relieved when they get a diagnosis. Quote, "A whole life reduced to a single point." That's a really reductive way to look at mental health problems, Shrier. Kindly fuck right off. Thank you. If you have further questions or concerns, please refer back to earlier this video where I talked about the utility of having diagnoses for psychiatric conditions. No industry refuses the prospect of exponential growth, and mental health experts are no exception. By feeding normal kids with normal problems into an unending pipeline, the mental health industry is minting patients faster than it can cure them. Oh yeah, that's right. She was kind of on the psych disorders can be cured train in the last book, wasn't she? Yeah, cool. Why not add big therapy onto the ever-expanding conspiracy pile? It couldn't be that maybe we're getting a more realistic representation of the different psychiatric conditions in the population now that it's less stigmatized. It's gotta be that youths who would be perfectly fine, maybe just a little sad or shy otherwise, are being medicalized. The rest of this is reiteration of the idea that the youths and their parents have been trained to think of themselves as broken and in need of a therapy fix. And Shrier is here to, quote, offer a little resistance. Oh, and she's still mad that her son was asked those screener questions. Well, we have been properly introduced to this book now. The first stop on this therapy bad tour is the idea that the various mental health professionals are giving or putting in the psychiatric disorders into the patients. Here we go again.